Well, welcome everybody. It's a real privilege and pleasure for me to be here today introducing John Dunn to give the Stimson Lectures for 2011. The Stimson Lecture series is a venerable lecture series that has produced some important books that have been published over the years by Yale University Press, just to mention a few of them. Samuel Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies, some people think was his best book, was started out as Stimson Lectures. Thomas Schelling's, which Schelling book was it? I forget which Schelling book it was actually, but one of Thomas Schelling's books on game theory and strategy started out as Stimson Lectures, and most recently Marwan Muasher's The Arab Center, The Promise of Modernization, a very important book, particularly timely given what's going on in the Middle East right now. So as I said, these are very lectures with a history, and we're very, very fortunate today to have John Dunn giving the Stimson Lectures. These are going to be 4 lectures beyond the democratic maze over the next 2 weeks. The title of today's talk is Diagnosing Democracy's Power. His second lecture, Understanding Democracy's Ascent, will take place tomorrow at the same time in the auditorium downstairs. Next week, on Tuesday and Wednesday, he'll lecture on Recognizing Democracy's Disorientation. And finally, Recovering Our Bearings, Fatality, Choice, and Comprehension. I'm not known for long introductions. I work on the assumption that nobody came here to listen to me, but came to listen to the speaker. But I do want to take a minute to say something about John. He's one of the most interesting and creative political theorists writing today. I've always been a great admirer of his. I first came to know of his work because of his tremendously important book on John Locke's political theory, which completely transformed Locke's scholarship for I would say generations, certainly for cohorts, as we might say, in the political theory trade, in that he unearthed the importance of the religious dimensions of Locke's writings and completely as a result, changed the way we think about not only Locke, but 17th century English political theory much more generally. Since then, he's written he's been a very prolific writer on many subjects. Another one of his particularly arresting books, I think, was a book that I first came across as an undergraduate called Western Political Theory in the Face of the Future. In recent years, he's written more and more and more about democracy, not only from Anglo dimensions, but a very good recent book that explored the French roots of democratic theory. And recently, he's become more and more interested, as I've learned from conversation, and I think we're going to learn more about in these lectures, about conflicts over and pressures toward the creation of democracy in Asia, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. But that's for John to talk about, not for me, and so I will live up to my promise of short introductions and welcome you, John, and thank you for coming. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's a great privilege and honor to speak in the footsteps of so many very eminent figures, some of them unmistakably great actors in the real world of politics. It's also through the harm it was doing to them then, it was also at that point, as it once again is now, inflicting massive collateral damage on the enduring human interests of America's own citizens. It matters very greatly how the citizens and political elites of this country apprehend democracy, what it means, what it causes in the world, what was required for it to come into existence in the first place or persist with any security. It matters for huge populations of which they know almost nothing, and because it matters so much for those, it's long mattered and is going to go on mattering for you and your children after you and your children's children as far as the eye can see. So, why does this word now hold such singular political authority? Where is the power that lurks so strangely within it? What exactly is it that modern populations are consenting to subject themselves to in accepting democracy's sway? You can hear that question in a number of different ways and try to answer it accordingly. In this lecture, I'll try to do so by retracing in outline the story of how it won that ascendancy. Sorry, in my next lecture I'll try to do that, but today I want first to get a grip on a prior issue, what the ascendancy itself really consists in. I think that's a two-part question. In the first place, what exactly is it that is in the ascendant in democracy's sway? What is democracy? And secondly, what is it about democracy that equips it to establish and sustain that sway? What is in the ascendant is quite elusive in content, but easy enough to recognize in form. In essence, it's a formula for imagining subjection to the power and will of others without sacrificing personal dignity or voluntarily jeopardizing individual or family interests. The standing of any such formula is necessarily precarious in political use, since subjection itself detracts painfully from dignity in the first place and rationally precludes complete assurance over the protection of any interests at all. You can see the imaginative pressure on the formula at once if you simply call to mind the fact that 300 years ago, virtually anywhere where the word democracy might possibly have been written or spoken, it was extremely close to being a synonym not for good but for bad government. It may perhaps have been a bit strident to claim that democracy 300 years ago was a pariah word. As my friend Quentin Skinner pointed out to me with some asperity when I did call it that, democracy did even then, after all, elicit a measure of respect on one prominent occasion from the unlikely figure of King Charles I, if admittedly under acute and unusual political pressure. But no one could mistake King Charles's sponsorship for unequivocal endorsement. The point he meant to concede wasn't that democracy on its own was a sufficient condition or even a helpful contribution to ensuring good government, but rather that democracy, painstakingly inserted into a highly constraining structure of countervailing power, could contribute something distinctive to the mix of benefits which mixed government that combined elements of democracy with usually rather more salient and consequential elements of monarchy and aristocracy as well, could be trusted to supply, and that under those constraints democracy could supply that benign supplement more dependably than unmixed monarchy or unadulterated aristocracy could be relied on to. That special additive, as Charles identified it in his celebrated answer to the 19 propositions in 1642, was liberty, a term of great ideological resonance in England's lengthy history, and a value that no English monarch could safely align themselves against. It wasn't an anodyne concession to politeness by a ruler in any case not noted for his tact, since there are grounds to see liberty in that rich, diffuse English sense as a fair counterpart to the freedom which the democrats of ancient Athens viewed as the principal benefit of their own democratic way of political life. And since the political setting in which the liberty of democracy featured in England's governmental structure was the elected House of Commons, which Charles had painstakingly prevented from meeting for over a decade precisely in order to free himself from its harassments and obstructions. For Charles himself, whatever else might be in doubt about how best to govern England, what was not in doubt was who was entitled to govern it, who was the sovereign, and who must submit themselves to being governed, who were the subjects. It was he who was the sovereign, and every other native-born person in the kingdom who were the subjects, and the gulf between the two was categorical and unbridgeable. As he stood on the scaffold nearly 7 years later, in January 1649, he insisted for the last time, "Truly, I desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody whomsoever, but I must tell you their liberty and freedom consists in having of government, those laws by which their life and their goods may be most their own. It is not for having a share in government, sir. That is nothing pertaining to them. A subject and a sovereign are clear different things." Now that isn't a tone we're still accustomed to hear in the English language, still less the American. But at any moment when sovereignty is located and applied, Charles was certainly right then, and he must be still just as right today as he was in 1649, even though by that year his own argument had turned brutally against him. Seen from the receiving end, what sovereignty asserts, requires, and imposes just is subjection. Whenever it no longer dares to assert or impose subjection, sovereignty itself has vanished away and not just been parcelled out into a miscellany of vaguely demarcated jurisdictions, as for many purposes it obviously now is. Subjection is an inherently distasteful and degrading condition, and most disconcertingly so at the point of incidence, at where it's applied. The special and enduring allure of democracy in competition with other regime titles isn't that it better ensures the service of the interests of the citizens, a very complicated and elusive causal calculation across time and space, precariously related to regime form, and one in which it often comes out quite badly. Where the allure lies is in the reconciliatory offer of the chance to assume subjection for yourself and share on notionally equal terms in selecting the person or persons who is going to deploy it. It's hard, and also sometimes wrong, not to be suspicious of this reconciliatory promise, not to see it, quite often in practice, largely as a mirage, a vision of water in the desert where the water unfortunately isn't there. But the water itself is a real enough need. What's illusory is where it appears to be, almost within reach. Any theory of sovereignty, any conceivable way of imagining and interpreting what it consists in, why it's there when it is there, and why in some form or other it's genuinely required, is going to over-authorize in practice. It's going to endorse far more claims than carry any critical validity. It will license more power in wholly untrustworthy hands than a steady vision of what's going on could possibly sanction. Democracy is no exception, and American democracy no more of an exception than any other national interpretation or experience of democracy. Indeed, American democracy's greatest claim to historical distinction, its impressive longevity and spatial amplitude, themselves guarantee that it must have encompassed, as it certainly in fact has, a huge range of excess authorization of the outcomes of sovereign choice. If you want power and if you attain it on any scale, you can't also hope to elude responsibility. Every sovereign state, to speak crassly, has blood on its hands. The older and bigger, all but inevitably, the more. In purely analytic terms, there's no reason to attribute democratic sovereign over-authorization to any special speciousness lurking in the category of democracy itself. I've got no wish to defame democracy, though little inclination to shield it from any infamy it earns in use. But all of us, for the present, at least in countries to any degree resembling this one, are caught up in the distinctive imaginative deceptions of democracy and exposed more deeply than we can possibly realize to its particular propensities to over-authorize and distort political and moral orientations as it does so. Sovereignty answers to a need on the part of its subjects, but it can only respond to that need by removing from them, sooner or later, any right or responsibility to judge for themselves how the sovereignty itself is to be exercised. Democracy, in any defensible understanding, any interpretation that isn't explicitly mendacious, restores that right and responsibility, however fleetingly, to every citizen, at least in leaving to them the choice over who exactly is to judge how the sovereignty is to be exerted. They personally authorize, however unwillingly or inadvertently, the judge or judges, and their own judgment therefore figures explicitly in the terms of their subjection. Just how legibly it so figures, and quite how accurately it calibrates and enforces their judgment, is open to serious dispute in any possible institutional rendering of democracy, and is in fact actively disputed in almost all decisions under democracy in which the citizens between them particularly care about the outcome. It's not characteristic of democracy, as Plato and Hobbes both definitively pointed out, that its reconciliatory offer of inclusion is reliably experienced in practice as either soothing or normatively unerring. Seen from that angle, the reconciliatory benediction of democracy looks a very poor bargain, an all but vacuous gesture in return for a dismayingly complete alienation of autonomy. In this country in particular, it violates the intimations of a remarkably wide range of sensibilities, from the Kantian elevation of devotion to equality of respect for every member of an often vividly unedifying species, to the surly defiance of governmental intrusion into any sphere beyond the defense of life, limb, and personal property. To see just why the democratic bargain has come to be so widely accepted in this of all countries, and why its acceptance here has come to seem to so many a good reason to believe it uniquely eligible for the rest of mankind, it's necessary to see three elements in close relation to one another. In the first place, the drastic need for government, which arises out of the practical economic and social organization of the human world as it now is. In the second place, the all but complete exhaustion of all rival or earlier reconciliatory formulae for motivating the acceptance of subjection. And thirdly, but every bit as consequential, the degree to which citizen acceptance of subjection in practice is inauthentic, provisional, insincere or impatient, and always open to decisive withdrawal. That, psychologically, is how citizenship now is, and very plausibly how it always has been and was always bound to remain. If citizenship, then that. That third element in the bargain's constituents is perhaps intuitively obvious and always recognized, at least tacitly, by everyone, though it certainly conflicts sharply with what most of us care to be heard saying. You could say that it's the democratic counterpart to prerogative or reason of state. the unstated intention to breach our own personal version of the social contract whenever we deem fit. In that sense, that tacit contract with its understandably tacit reservations is indeed, in the memorable phrase of Robert Nozick, not worth the paper it's not written on. What grounds the third element, plainly, is the prospectively massive personal inconvenience, sooner or later, of cleaving to the contract in unenvisaged circumstances, a consideration within the imaginative reach of almost anyone. But the grounds for the first two elements couldn't be imaginatively immediate in quite the same way. In the midst of militant anarchy in downtown Mogadishu, or the vast hellhole of the eastern reaches of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the need for government is apparent enough, but the prospect of its effective supply in any form which it would be sane to trust is utterly implausible. The currency of democracy as a regime named today must be understood in settings where relatively effective government already exists, and not where it's conspicuously absent, or on the premise that democracy as a political idea, or any institutional embodiment of that idea, might themselves hold the causal capacity to usher effective government into existence anywhere at all. The idea of vindicating the authority of any particular claimant to governmental power by underlining the pressing urgency of the need for some form of effective government, Hobbes's great idea, wilts in political practice just where it's needed most, where the government is of limited efficacy and faces at least some immediate challenger with vivid appeals to some of those it needs to govern more effectively. Once an incumbent government faces serious insurgent challenge, Hobbes's train of thought ceases to discriminate decisively between the challenger and challenged, and differentiates ever more feebly between them as the challenge rises in intensity. Whatever the imaginative value of seeing democracy as a cheaper functional surrogate for civil war, it can't in itself furnish a reason for shifting allegiance within such a war, or lessening the effort to secure victory for the side towards which you yourself happen to feel allegiance. Just as democracy can't, except by providential accident, vindicate the territorial scope of any given state, it can only serve to identify the legitimate rulers of a demos, a people, which already views itself as a people, a distinct body of human beings who belong decisively together. But supposing a government duly available and territorial perimeter and civic membership each settled at least temporarily, whether by common consent or through political or military exhaustion, it isn't difficult to see how democracy on its own can help to reconcile a population to its need to continue to be governed effectively. Why, after all, should any population be willing to reconcile itself not to being governed at all, but to be governed by those who currently happen to govern it? Populations can accept subjection, following Max Weber, on at least three very different bases. They can accept subjection because they see themselves as having good reason to accept it within a framework of practices presumptively composed of good reasons the whole way through, an optimistic vision of a process which has been running hard for some little time in societies in which most of us here now live. They can also accept subjection instead out of awe, a condition less frequently encountered nowadays, not least in the United States, and perhaps never overwhelmingly common or very protractedly sustained anywhere at all. Or in the third place, they can accept it simply out of habit, because they've done so protractedly already and can barely imagine doing otherwise, or have simply forgotten how to. All three bases for accepting subjection, tradition, charisma, rationality, have obvious elements of precariousness. Few civil wars of any violence in a globalized capitalist world are likely to leave tradition in good working order, because civil war is highly disruptive of habit. The longer, the fiercer, the nastier, the more disruptive. Charisma, however amplified by modern techniques of mass long-distance impression management and media control, is a wasting asset, though it continues to punctuate the political history of most countries at whimsical intervals. Where democracy has inserted and established its legitimatory sway has been within the historical domain of relatively well-settled government in largely pacified states situated within a dynamically globalizing capitalist economy. One natural way of seeing just why it's done so in that setting is to view its arrival in classical mode as the replacement of two obsolete and inherently implausible, if reasonably concrete and determinate, claimants to rule, a monarchy or a presumptive aristocracy or oligarchy of some kind, by a third residual claimant with no special plausibility in itself, always manifestly incapable of ruling as and by itself on any scale, and hence in need from the outset of a mystificatory proxy to do its rule for it, and one which would thrust the issues of entitlement or capacity to rule beyond any possibility of cognitive accountability. Where monarchs or aristocrats can no longer, as Lenin put it, go on in the old way, who is left to try to do so but everyone else, the people in its full sovereign indefinition? That's what you see if you view democracy's ascent as the triumph of one form of government over two of its historically protracted predecessors. And that historical sequence is indeed unmistakably there in the record. But what would be ingenuous would be to take that historical sequence as self-explanatory, or interpret its outcome docilely on its own terms. If we press the question of why the demos, who plainly can't now rule in the United States or anywhere else, are less implausible claimants to do so than their decisively ousted predecessors, the answer can't simply be that they're so much harder to get into clear focus or keep in focus where you fleetingly succeed in doing so. Forms of government aren't freestanding institutional structures which stand or fall with the identity and socio-economic properties of those who inhabit them. They're also always elaborated imaginative proposals, certainly embodied in complex organizational arrangements and staged by varyingly active human denizens, but extensively dependent throughout for their stability or vulnerability on the inherent imaginative plausibility of what they're proposing. The most consequential and elusive political property of the United States, over 170 years since Tocqueville's second volume, is still the imaginative force of its own distinctive interpretation of the basis on which the demos, its very own people, exercises its all but unchallengeable rule. In the United States, by now, that basis has become indistinguishable from tradition. It's been so for a long time. It can still blaze into charisma briefly at particular historical moments, and it furnishes the dense web of legal rationality or rational legality that makes up the nation's public life. It's all things to all persons and almost all the time. But in most of the rest of the world, by contrast, democracy's sway, where it's been exercised at all, has been much briefer, far less secure, and vastly more heterogeneous in its imaginative rendering. It's had to penetrate much thicker armor, and it's had to struggle to bring to order far more turbulent spaces. It's faced rivals to its rule who were far more formidable from the outset, and those rivals have come far closer at some points to crushing it definitively. It's never felt for long that it was living a charmed life. And yet it is democracy, the third of this simple Greek triad of governmental forms, which has somehow or other won through up to the present as mandatory basis for interpreting the authority of government across most of the world. Why ever should that have turned out to be so? It certainly can't have been because of long-gone Greek brilliance captured in the vocabulary like a fly in the amber. And the reason why it can't isn't merely because it would be impolite or transgressive to say so. The true answers to many urgent questions throughout human history have always been somewhat impolite and quite often drastically transgressive as well. In ancient Greece, democracy wasn't the stable majority outcome of the competition between forms of government for Greek communities, even left to their own devices. It couldn't have been so because there was no stable outcome, and no one could readily mistake the relative eligibility of democracy for the clear conclusion of consecutive rational thought conducted in Greek across the classical period. If democracy in its equivocal contemporary sense has recently shown itself the fittest survivor in competition between forms of government across the world, a verdict like all Darwinian verdicts permanently open to reversal, that necessarily provisional outcome can't be due to the epistemic felicity or interpretative wealth lurking in that simple Greek triad, or the vocabulary that expresses it. Where it must lie is in something quite different and decidedly less reassuring. The imaginative potential for identification left fully open by the third term of the triad, democracy. Since that potential is left so fully open, it can scarcely in principle have, democracy can scarcely in principle have any elective affinity with either law or reason. Law, because it's so pervasively there, at least in any modern society, and because that very presence must at any point stand so clearly over against the immediate will of any particular persons, and still more of all persons, somehow implausibly compressed together into a notional unity. Reason, because it seeks structure, determinacy, and even certitude, where the latter proves available, while the demos, because it's presumed to follow its own will by the light of its own mind, repudiates any structure or determinacy which lies beyond the scope of that will or the fitful illumination of that mind, and is ill-equipped to muster certitude on any issue of real consequence. Under democracy, the demos ultimately authorizes or deauthorizes law, and it monitors and adjudicates the claims of reason to interpret what that law is and requires. It does so predominantly through a body of legal specialists who may have little cognitive respect for or imaginative sympathy with the great majority of their fellow citizens, except where those citizens are playing a part within its rituals long hallowed by custom, as for example in the jury. Over most of the dense web of constraint and guidance through which law falls upon individual members of the society, therefore, the authority of the demos, if present at all, hovers very far back and seldom or never makes itself felt directly. It's not because we value or expect legality, not because we wish law to rule or confidently expect it to prove able to, that we've chosen democracy as the one ground on which we can accept subjection, or at least accept it to that very conditional degree to which any of us genuinely do embrace our own subjection. Other people's subjection may be on balance reassuring, but who could rejoice at their own? Democracy isn't the rule of law. It doesn't ensure it, and it's still far from clear that it may not in the end even preclude it. The rule of law, still more evidently, isn't democracy. Its attractions aren't those of democracy. Its irritations aren't those of democracy. Its dangers aren't those of democracy. At most, each of those two is a distinct partial good with every potentiality to conflict with the other. On the whole today, we probably value legality on balance quite a lot more than we do democracy, since its benefits, where available, are both more salient and quite a lot more reliable. Almost anyone, sooner or later, can see and feel the advantages of retaining their own property rights, however modest in scope, within the framework of the existing law, a point obviously depended on by Charles I. Where it offers advantages, the advantages of legality are immediate and comfortingly personal. They accrue to each of those to whom they do accrue. Just what the net advantages of democracy are, by contrast, remains an altogether more speculative judgment, requiring the assessment of very intricate causalities at a considerable distance from the life and experience of any given individual. As Hobbes flamboyantly insisted, almost anyone's personal experience of democracy in action is bound, sooner or later, to come out acutely disconcerting. What's true, however, and what's a very great moment in understanding democracy's ascent, is that in numerous settings across the world, and most of all in this great state, democracy has come to be accepted and understood as the content and basis of an existing regime in which, to a significant degree, law does rule. Not, of course, through its own inherent power, since it doesn't have any, but by the more or less grudging consent of those who do in fact do so. At the very least, most contemporary advocates or partisans of democracy believe it largely compatible in practice with the rule of law. Not a few of them also assume it, in defiance of logic or conceptual clarity, to enjoy an elective affinity with the rule of law, just as they assume it to enjoy one with the causal dynamics and normative presuppositions of a capitalist economy. Those assumptions, severally and together, are, as you all have noticed, deeply lodged in the political tradition and ideological sensibility of the United States. But considered soberly, in the abstract and on their own terms, they make singularly little sense. Over most of the Earth's inhabited surface, they are very far from capturing the intimations or carrying the authority of such residues of tradition as remain in working order. And they can't even begin to explain why democracy as an idea, or even a slogan, can possess the momentum to establish the right to govern for anyone at all, still less to generate the capacity to govern effectively anywhere where that capacity isn't already amply in evidence. In very many different respects, America's espousal of democracy is not a hermeneutic aid to fathoming how the rest of the world sees and hears and feels the meaning of that intensely political concept. For one thing, it confounds systematically and sometimes quite purposefully a very drastic process of power with a competition for allegiance between political ideas. The process of power was one in which a temporarily uniquely rich and potent society settled to the project of remaking the world in its own image, as China's emperors had done on their own impressive historical stage for very considerably longer. The process of power was real enough, and it's yet to reach a decisive end. But the competition for allegiance between political ideas was always somewhat illusory, a Hegelian shadow play of flickering images of far more elusive struggles between varyingly frank and confused individuals and political groupings. It was in and through those struggles that democracy as a political conception or slogan has scrabbled up the cliff of history. The question to press is just what it has offered to those who have chosen to take it up, and why, when and where they have done so, they've seen and felt it to carry those offers. If you see the historical canvas of democracy's ascent in those terms, it's clear at once that what it depicts superimposes and intersects very different sorts of process, each with their own distinctive causalities. You can, if you want, envisage it as a single process, defined by and in part orchestrated through the spatial passage and temporal vicissitudes of this single word and the prodigious proliferation of human experience that swarmed around it as it's moved forwards and outwards from its very distant Greek starting point. That's history as pageantry, with all its terrors and exhilarations intact. But to see it that way isn't only overwhelmingly beyond my own paltry competence, it's not at all how to capture how I wanted to see it. The two questions I want to press are firstly, just what is the political meaning of that spatial passage and those temporal vicissitudes? What are their political implications? And secondly, just why have they occurred as and when they have? What explains their occurrence? If you superimpose the two stories, you can't see either clearly. If you fail to recognize their causal intersection, you condemn yourself to misjudging what does explain them, and you're all too likely to misunderstand their political implications. So to recognize that is to register, I think, a genuine methodological dilemma, but it isn't necessarily to reach an epistemic impasse. Political understanding, insofar as it's available at all, insofar as politics really is intelligible, even in principle, subsists in and must confine itself to a rather more modest epistemic register. The frame in which I want to persuade you to recognize what's happened in democracy's erratic global ascent is the continuous interrelation of two distinct dimensions, each a decisive abstraction from the full giddy pageant and trauma of history. Both have prominent idealist elements, as history is bound to if you focus hard and steadily enough on it. Both pass continuously through the dynamics of the human mind in operation and must be recognized to depend on doing so, if they're to be understood at all. Neither has any trace of the ethereal. This setting of democracy's ascent is in the first place the global history of human political experience, a space the magnitude, complexity and opacity of which none of us can steadily contemplate or hope to take in, but within the cumulative residues of which all of us are now condemned and privileged to live, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. That's the stage of every human life now. There's nowhere beyond it or outside it, no dependable historical or geographical privacy left. A lot of democracy's own instability and opacity as a political category, or even as a political phenomenon, now issues from its being so unmistakably at the heart of that relentless elimination of seclusion. Many anywhere in the world must view democracy's presence or prospective arrival with misgivings, and few anywhere can be wholly confident. This is very important right at the moment, can be wholly confident that it offers them any personal guarantee of safety, prosperity, or existential reassurance. But no regime in the world today, anywhere where there recognizably is a regime, no inhabited space which has escaped the state of nature, is immune to the need to address itself to this term, however open and uninhibited the antipathy with which it views it. It's easy to see the passage of the word itself as meaninglessly epiphenomenal, an immense flotilla of tiny corks bobbing helplessly around in the great deluge of human experience. But that, I'm trying to convince you, isn't a politically perceptive judgment. Both word and category are far more tightly woven into the fabric of this unfolding story. They catch and carry too much feeling and judgment and shape far too much active political purpose as it moves towards the present. Whatever proves to be true in the future, even if democracy as a political category or value was somehow to be extirpated from every human community in centuries ahead, the political space within which that outcome could arise and the political agents who would bring it about would by now be quite largely creatures of its prior passage as a category. All that is just to remind you, perhaps rather melodramatically, of the huge stake we all now hold in understanding the provenance of the term as we see and hear and feel it today, and the dynamics and weight of the experience that's given it that grip on us. The second dimension is less hectic in tone and perhaps also analytically more tractable. If the first focuses perforce on the experience, political, social, and economic, of stupefying numbers of human beings, the second concentrates on a domain where political scientists can feel more at home, on political struggle itself, and more particularly on the vicissitudes of political concepts within political struggle. What matters there, for my purposes, isn't the incidence of political struggle, the forms it assumes, the range of participants it pulls into it, or even its outcomes and what causes those outcomes to eventuate as they do and not come out quite differently. Instead, it's what political struggle discloses about political concepts themselves. The dimension I want to capture is the respect in which political struggle constitutes and operates as a set of heuristics for political concepts, testing inexorably their realism, clarity, normative insight, and potential to shape goals and consolidate purposes for possible allies and subvert the power and deplete the will of possible or actual adversaries. That, too, is the space in which democracy has won so very recently its giddy global eminence. Fiercely contested throughout, but then in this of all spaces no concept could ever sanely aspire to move beyond contest. It's in that space above all that democracy has most unmistakably shown itself unmatched in the power to recruit allies and quell rivals in face of every other category so far defined in the history of human speech. If you see those two dimensions, as we plainly should, as twin facets of a single integrated causal story, it's clear at once that the relative analytical tractability of the second is important. That democracy has won its present eminence in and through the global history of human political experience is, I think, just a truism. But the truth it expresses is overwhelmingly abstract, and the infinite array of concrete causalities it unfolds could never be clearly known to any human being. Much of it is now irrecoverably lost, and what might still be recovered, say the entire epistemic domain of modern political science, past, present, and near future, is a most unpromising guide to the whole. If the heuristic which has established democracy's superiority in the present epoch in realism, clarity, and potential to shape goals and consolidate purposes for potential allies and weaken and demoralize prospective adversaries has been political struggle itself, it must be right to see democracy's global comparative advantage in the breadth of the field over which it can solicit identification and the relative narrowness of the space it's pre-condemned to exclude as illicit, nefarious, or actively malign. That was essentially the appeal of the Abbé Sieyès to the third estate of the Ancien Régime, and it was also the claim to authority he advanced on their behalf. Unlike the partisans of monarchical power or the open champions of aristocracy, the political nation, as Sieyès conceived it, was pre-committed to excluding only those who chose to exclude themselves from it, those who claimed and fully meant to stand above the law it invoked and recognized and free themselves from the constraints that law imposed, by determining its content uninhibitably for themselves. In a temporary vacuum of authority, there couldn't readily be a wider appeal within a given space for a given population, though the political balance would, of course, be affected by the numbers of those who claimed the privilege. The breadth of an appeal, of course, is no index of its credibility, its sheer power to induce belief, and by that measure democracy has been no more charismatic than any other political category. But by that measure it's hard to see how any political category could be charismatic in and of itself, and how even those categories most historically efficacious in inducing belief in one context could hope to sustain it as the context changed, as all political contexts do sooner or later. If the identificatory appeal of democracy is personal and purposefully indiscriminate in the persons it chooses to address, that breadth and lack of fastidiousness could be, and often has been, lethally repellent to those best placed to defend themselves. But levelled indefinitely and repeatedly over ever larger spaces, its lengthening sequence of particular defeats has been increasingly outweighed by its raw political appeal. It's hard to see how any rival could press its personal appeal more widely or less discriminatingly, or offset a narrower and more discriminating personal address by anything other than consistently proven efficacy, a necessarily vulnerable title to power in any human setting. The human world hasn't come to embrace democracy in the muddled, partial, halting manner in which it now does, because it's come to believe in democracy as a solid and reliable foundation for authority, but because it's come increasingly to disbelieve in any other sort of human basis on which to do so, and to distrust compulsively over time all humanly mediated claims to ground it on some supra-human basis. We shouldn't see democracy's global ascent as a stunning triumph of credulity or a majestic forward march of justified true belief, but simply as an uneven, reluctant, painful series of surrenders of an immense miscellany of other kinds of belief. That's a familiar enough picture, plausibly associated with some elements of the European Enlightenment, whatever you think that was or wasn't. But it's easy enough to recognize that the picture it offers isn't that of the Enlightenment as didactic would-be mentor to mankind, but as nervous prophet of the chilly landscape to come. If you see democracy's ascent in that more disabused perspective, you couldn't sanely suppose, whatever else it does or suffers or is enforced to yield unto in the centuries to come, that democracy is a synonym for good government. Under democracy, we may be lucky enough to experience good government, but good government isn't something we're entitled to expect, either normatively or epistemically. Under democracy, the responsibility for assessing how far government is in fact good plainly doesn't rest principally on the government, either as a discrete actor or a miscellany of varyingly coherent agencies. Instead, it falls on the citizens at large, and the responsibility for amending its aberrations also in the end falls unrelentingly on those same citizens as a whole. It's rude for a foreign visitor to say such things, but it's also, I think, incumbent on them to tell the truth as they see it. As it looks at present to a foreign eye from China or Iran or Burma or Switzerland or Germany or Norway or even from England, it's hard to see the citizenry of the United States at present as especially successful in furnishing themselves with good government under their uniquely time-tested and elastic democratic formula. I don't want to suggest that that protracted impasse is somehow democracy's fault, merely that democracy of all political formulae requires each of us to try to understand why such outcomes arise and why they sometimes persist with such apparent obstinacy. Under democracy, unlike most other political rubrics, you can't blame that outcome merely on the temporary and contingent ascendancy of the nefarious or congenitally foolish. We, the people, are the nefarious and the foolish every bit as much as the fine and the wise. When we choose badly, we have no one to blame but ourselves. Once we start to quarrel, and of course we never actually stop quarrelling about just who is wise or foolish, virtuous or ill-intentioned, the common frame of identification and the authorization it provides drop away, and we're left with very little but our mutual antipathies and contempts.